think he has hope, but his hope is founded upon the fact that he has seen the worst that can happen.
Absolutely.
And also that it hasn't yet destroyed him,
No.
even though it's touch and go a lot of the time.
Yeah, I used to quote in the Unquiet, I think, I tell them there is no forgiveness, but there is always forgiveness. It's a quote from Michael Collins, which I loved, that idea that there is always hope. There is always some possibility of acceptance.
That's your Catholic background.
That is my Catholic background. Yeah, I know. If it was a Baptist, you think everybody was going to go to hell except you. But what I always thought was that crime fiction, even the very darkest of crime fiction, people often say, well, why would you read stuff that's so dark? Because occasionally, especially my mother's friends, who don't read a lot of crime fiction, she reads really dark stuff, will say, why do you read stuff that's so dark? And I think even the darkest of crime fiction has a kind of hope to it. To some degree, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that idea of Burke of not standing by because you can make a difference by acting. But also because crime writers, again and again, we don't reflect life the way it is. We really don't. And we don't have any duty to do that. What we do is offer sometimes the way life might be. A kind of example, when I was a reporter for the Irish Times, I covered the killing of a girl named Belinda Pereira. And this influenced me greatly. It's one of those things, those moments in your life when you're on a cusp of something and then you cross it. And she was killed in Dublin at Christmas 1996 in a small apartment. And Dublin wasn't a very violent city. It's still not a terribly violent city. We have maybe more gang crime than we used to, but still not a lot of that kind of casual homicide, and particularly the killing of a young woman at Christmas. And people were very distressed, and people thought this was terrible because it emerged she wasn't Irish, she was Sri Lankan by way of England. And people thought it was terrible. This young woman should have died so far from home at a time of year when people should be together and people should be a little bit nicer to each other. And then a couple of days later, it emerged that Belinda Pereira had come over to Dublin to work as a call girl because her parents, she'd done a little bit of it in England, but her parents were separating. Her mother wanted to go back to Sri Lanka. It was a very bitter divorce. And I think Belinda thought, well, this is the way that I have made ends meet before, and I can do it again. And in the course of this, she was killed. And people's attitudes towards her changed, and they made two judgments on her, I think. The first was that her death was not as terrible as if she had been a nurse or a secretary or a doctor, and the other was that she'd asked for it because of the nature of the work that she did and the nature of the people that she was probably going to meet. And I felt very, very strongly that there was nothing that this young woman could have done in her life to merit the kind of end she met. She was beaten to death to the degree that she was unidentifiable. And it influenced my books a lot. And in Dark Hollow, the second book I wrote, I based a character around her. I based a character around Belinda Pereira. And at the end of that book, the person responsible for killing her is found and is punished. In real life, the people who killed her, and they know who it is. They think it was two pimps from Monaghan, which is a county towards the north of Ireland. They're never going to be tried. Unless one of them has a sudden huge qualm of conscience on his deathbed and feels the urge to confess, which seems very unlikely, they're not going to be tried. And this young woman's death is going to be left unanswered and unavenged. And that's what crime fiction does. Crime fiction offers us a kind of sense of hope at the end of it. Even the grimmest of it never ends without some glimmer of hope.
I'm not sure if I'd agree with you that it's hope. I think what it does is it offers resolution. I'm not sure that.
But do you think
that is hope?
Well, I think a resolution without hope isn't a resolution that I want to read. A resolution can be a very dark thing. A resolution can say, well, there is no hope. That's a resolution.
Right.
But I don't think crime fiction, by and large, even somebody as bleak as Elroy, never says there is no hope. You know, if that was the case, I wouldn't even want to write a book like that. I certainly wouldn't want to read it, and I couldn't write it. I couldn't write a book. I don't believe that. Or I don't believe that that is the way I want to interpret the world through my fiction. I think that would be just like banging my head against a brick wall until I bled.
Well, you put your characters in some pretty dire places, and also there's sort of, a slight cliffhanger certainly at the end of this book, everybody's going, what next? One of the things that's so interesting about your fiction is you write about such horrible things in such beautiful language. You and James Lee Burke are the two writers I know who do this the best.
Well, I was very influenced by Burke. Jack Nicholson once said of Marlon Brando, when he dies, everyone else moves up one. And it's a bit like that for Burke, and I think a generation of younger writers. I imagine Dennis Lehane would probably say the same thing. Burke was a model, I think, for those of us who felt that crime fiction didn't have to be written in this very sparse, terse language. It didn't have to be pared back, that it could be expansive, that it could use metaphor, that it could use poetry, that it could use aspects of the natural world, that everything was fair game.
Even the metaphysical, as in
Absolutely.
his book with the Confederacy.
Yeah, all of those things were and yet again, you know, Burke's a Catholic, good Catholic. And you wonder...
French.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, no, actually, I'm Irish.
No, his wife. No,
his father was.
yeah.
His great grandfather was from Waterford. I think.
You're right. Why? Oh, I know why. It's because he's from New Orleans. I'm thinking that
There
he's
you
more
go.
Cajun.
Yeah, no,
but
he
is
brings the Irish with him. Hey, we need to claim all the ones we can. Don't be
That's
taking that
right.
away from
Sorry.
us. St. Patrick and James Lee Burke. But I loved that about him. I loved his use of language. And he and MacDonald through his empathy and Burke through his language, altered the way that I looked at fiction. And I don't think I would write the kind of books I write if I hadn't read Burke. And it took me a long time. And I probably still haven't quite emerged from the shadow of his influence. He was a huge influence on me. And when I wrote my first book, because he doesn't fly, and I'd never met him, and I interview people occasionally for the Irish Times, which is the newspaper I used to write for. I thought I will take a detour from my tour and I will go and interview Burke in Montana. And I flew in and drove up to his house, and he was an exquisitely sweet man, which was great because I didn't want to meet somebody who was so important to me in my writing and find them to be awful, and he wasn't, but I was really anxious to impress him. And I think after listening to me witter on for an hour about how wonderful he was, he got just bored. And he said, well, maybe we should. He said, I usually go for a walk at this time of day. And I said, oh, that sounds great, Mr. Burke, sir. Let's go for a walk. So we got in a car, and he had a friend from Louisiana with him, and we drove up into the Great Rattlesnake Wilderness, which is near his house. And we met this old guy who lived right at the edge of the wilderness, and he had a couple of dogs with him, and he said, oh, I'll come and join you for a walk. And they began talking about a tourist who had been walking up the week before, and who had encountered a mountain lion. And mountain lions don't particularly like tourists wandering onto their territory. And so this guy had kept the mountain lion at bay with a sharp stick for 3 miles as he backed down the road with the lion following him the whole way. And when you hear a story like that, the first thing you do is you start looking for a stick. You know, okay, what did I not bring? I didn't bring a stick. So that was resonating with me as we went for a walk, and I was chatting with Burke's friend, and gradually we realised we couldn't hear anybody else. So we kind of stopped and realised there was nobody else near us, that we got lost in the Great Rattlesnake Wilderness. You don't want to get lost in places with rattlesnake in the title, or Black Widow, or anything like that. And so we kind of went around plaintively going, hello, Mr. Burke, sir. And eventually the old guy's dogs found us. And I thought, this man I so desperately wanted to impress had to rescue me at the end of a very long day for him and for me. And I like the fact that he never said anything about it again. He didn't go, you idiot, you Irish idiot. He was very nice about it. And we've met once or twice since then, and he's continued to be exceptionally nice.
He's a lovely guy. He's been to see us many times. We are blessed with the fact that he has a child who lives here.
Really? I didn't know that.
He does. And so we're lucky, because you're right, he doesn't fly, but he has often come to see us, and he has a beautiful daughter. Well, he actually has more than one, but the beautiful one I'm referring to, Alifair, is also a writer, and now lives in New York and teaches law at Hofstra. But the La Famille Burke, to get back to the French, has sort of been part of our lives. And as a result, because it is my religious rule to read the books of all authors who signed at our store. Actually, I try to read all the books by all of you every year, but that's a somewhat daunting task, and I'm not always 100% on it, but I am 100%, or Patrick of our staff, on reading all of the books for authors who make an appearance with us. And I have been introduced to some writers conceivably I would have skipped had it not been for their coming here and this rule that we have. And I knew that Burke had a high degree of violence in his books, that there was a lot going on, but he came to see us, and so I read one, and I remember I was just stunned. I was reading about the most really horrible, visceral things in language that was, so elegant, and I was just marveled at the contrast. I mean, actually, Raymond Chandler could do that a little. You know, he has some passages where he has some really. I've never been a Hammett fan. I've always found Hammett was more about process than he was about character.